Hi everyone. The Bub Report is committed to being fearless, balanced, and independent, bringing you the stories that matter most without compromise. Now do us a favor. Remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Hit the bell so you never miss an update. You can also watch us on GBN TV every Wednesday at 5 p.m. Catch us on WPG10 television every Sunday at 8 p.m. Your support helps us to keep journalism free from bias and influence. And together, we can make sure every voice is heard and every fact is verified. Thanks for watching. Viewers and listeners, welcome back to the first segment of the program. Of course, we are following developments with respect to Cuba and the region. And here to make sense of all of these developments is a Cuba specialist, Professor Isaac Saini. Of course, he is in Canada at the moment. But Professor Saini, we thank you for availing us your presence. Of course, this very important conversation. Of course, the reason why I wanted to kick off this segment is because, Professor, we have seen a number of developments with respect to Cuba. Of course, Lindsey Graham articulated that Cuba is next with respect to militaristic invasion there, of toppling the regime there in Cuba. And of course, we have also seen in the context of the Caribbean, of course, the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, Kamala Prasad-Bissessar, she attended this right-wing Shield of the Americas summit. Again, that's what it was. It was a right-wing event. And in the Caribbean region, of course, I believe the president of Ghana was also there, President Ali. Given that the progressive bent of his political party in Ghana, that was surprising, I suppose, for especially for students of history like myself. And of course, we've also seen in the context of Jamaica, Antigua, and now Guyana, they're sending home all of the Cuban medical mission workers. So let us begin by having a conversation, sir, about the history of Cuba and the history of Cuba in CARICOM. And do you see what's happening now in the context of CARICOM's posture, especially a country like Guyana, Trinidad, home of the Black Power movement, Jamaica, home of Norman Manley? I mean, I'm not surprised, given who the prime minister is in Jamaica, that he's betraying Cuba. Of course, you know, he's a successor to Edward Seaga, so that does not surprise me. But let us talk about that Caribbean betrayal against the backdrop of the support and allyship that Cuba has given to the region historically.
Yeah, no, it's shocking. It shows a lack of principle, a lack of, shall we say, appreciation for what Cuba has done. I know there are many commentators who are extremely upset about it. I know that Sekaya Thomas, who is the chair of the International Steering Committee of Global African Congress, which is this major civil society group driving reparations alongside the state sector in the Caribbean, has written letters, right, to the heads of CARICOM, to the Prime Minister of Jamaica, and so forth. And it's truly shocking. I know the United States has brought a significant amount of pressure to bear on these countries on the issues of visas, on the issues of, possible economic retaliation and so forth. And so, in a sense, one understands those objective material pressures. But Cuba has done so much in terms of training doctors, right? In terms of providing doctors. I mean, as Mia Motley put, the Prime Minister of Barbados said, they would not have made it through COVID without Cuban doctors, right? But it's not only that, it's also Cuba's articulation on the world stage, right, about the rights of small island nations, of the Caribbean nations, of the global South, right? They've been one of the most profound and powerful voices, and I often would argue prophetic voices, right? But it's also the question of, what does self-determination and sovereignty in the Caribbean mean, right? If you can't defend Cuba from what has been denounced by over 30 consecutive United Nations votes as a criminal, illegal, immoral economic warfare waged by the United Nations on this heroic island. So I think that's truly, truly astonishing. And what they're looking for, and they're coddling up to people like Mark Rubio, the cuddling up to Donald Trump, the openly embracing of the Monroe Doctrine, which is his hyper-aggressive conversion of the Monroe Doctrine in the 21st century. It's like expecting crumbs to fall from his table, and it's I think it's truly astonishing, as if Trump cares about these small nations. Yes, he did invite the only two in persons he invited was Kamala Bissessa and Prasad and Irfan Ali. But I think if they expect that Donald Trump really cares about the Caribbean nations, cares about the future of the Caribbean, I think they'll be sadly mistaken. And more importantly, what does this mean? We've talked about this before in a previous show. What does this, and this is even worse now, mean for Caribbean unity? How does CARICOM now, in a world of tremendous geopolitical changes, negotiate this? So I think for me, there's a number of things around this. One, it's the betrayal of Cuba and what they've done. It's a violation of, I would think, fundamental principle, right? The other thing is the issues of what does it mean to self-determination and sovereignty if you let the United States strangle Cuba as it's attempting to do and you abandon them in their hour of need. The third thing is obviously expecting that you will actually earn some crumbs from Trump's table, as if Trump actually cares about these countries. And probably the most important point as well is we're in the midst of geopolitical changes across the world, right? And by tying yourself to Trump's coattails, when those geopolitical changes seem almost inevitable, right? The economic center of the world, the locus, its focal point is shifting east, right? And the new rising poles of influence and power, a multipolar world. And so if we tie our fortunes, right? If the Caribbean ties its fortunes to a declining imperial power when new poles of power are emerging, right? There might be consequences to bear. It's interesting to look at Canada. In the case of Canada, where I live, you can see that Prime Minister Carney is trying to play both sides. He's hedging his bets. In many ways, he's cozying up to Trump. He has, basically spoken about in different ways, supporting and then reining back in the current war of aggression that's unfolding in the West Asia, i.e. the so-called Middle East against Iran. At the same time, he's creating new relations, attempting to create new relations with other countries, right, in the global South. And I think the Caribbean needs to think about, like in the long-term future, where will we stand when these new geopolitical configurations, which are now inchoate, which you can just barely glimpse, right, actually crystallize?
Absolutely, Professor. But let us talk about Guyana, though.
Yeah.
And the history of Cuba with Guyana, and the fact that President Ali leads a political organization in Guyana that has historically been considered progressive. Let us talk about that history.
Yeah. No, it's obvious, with the PPP, right? That was led by Chetty Jagan, right? As a Marxist, right? In fact, people often forget he was the first elected Marxist leader in the Western Hemisphere. People talk about Allende, but it was him, and then he was overthrown by the machinations of the CIA and the British working together, right? And then the support he received from Cuba, right, as we had the Forbes-Burnham dictatorship, okay, with fraudulent election imposed, and the support that Cuba has given, right, to the Guyanese as they gave to the Caribbean. So here we have not just a betrayal of what Cuba has done, but a betrayal of fundamental principles. And I'm sure Chetty Jagan, right, and other progressives from that party would be, to use the old cliche, spinning in their graves to see what has unfolded, right? And what's interesting, and I'll say this, I was in Guyana, in Barbados, right, for the 50th anniversary celebrations of CARICOM, right, of CARICOM relations with Cuba, right, and Irfan Ali was there, and there was a moment where they also were marking in Barbados the anniversary of the blowing up of Cubana airliner 455, which is the first case, right? And in fact, so far, I think the first case of blowing up of a civilian airliner, right, through a terrorist act in the Caribbean, killing over 70 Cuban civilians.
Just to give context, it was the Americans who were accused of blowing it up.
Yeah, and they did. In fact, it was Orlando Bosch, who actually did that. There's a declassified CIA document. I encourage people to go to the National Security Archives, right? You can just type it in Google, and they have all these declassified CIA documents and U.S. government documents. And in one of these documents, he talks about a bus going over a cliff with 72 dogs in it, if I remember correctly, right? And so, the CIA was deeply involved and complicit in this blowing up of this airliner, right? And so there's a monument in Barbados, and the monument was was refurbished and thus rededicated. And at this CARICOM, this meeting celebrating CARICOM in Barbados, the president of Cuba, Miguel Diaz-Canel, was there, and so was Irfan Ali, right? He was there, okay, at this meeting, right? Okay, and embracing Miguel Diaz-Canel and sprouting all sorts of progressive and radical revolutionary language, right? And to see him sort of descend from that to basically embracing Marco Rubio and Donald Trump as they basically violate international law, right? And carry on this criminal act of collective punishment, right? Against Cuba, this economic warfare that is absolutely illegal and criminal and violates all known, as I said, international norms, and also has its genocidal features, is truly, truly astonishing, right? But when you face that kind of economic pressure, is one thing, but also when people think there's going to be gains that are made, right? And there's been people who've been talking about this and are so incensed about this betrayal, not only from Ghana but from other countries, and also say, well, their economic vested interests, perhaps even class interests that are involved here as well, where not only are people feeling that economic pressure, but they buy into the neoliberal nostrums, right? And so in a sense, it's truly galling, right? And I'm sure Chetty Jagan and Janet Jagan and other progressives will be truly astonished, right, at this. And I'm sure Walter Rodney, right, who led the Working People's Alliance and who's obviously a giant himself, right, would be appalled at what Guyana is doing right now and what so many Caribbean countries are doing right now.
Let us talk about, in the context of Cuba and the Global South and allyship, I don't think people get just how involved Cuba was with so many Black liberation struggles around the world. I mean, you look at what occurred in apartheid South Africa. I mean, the United States also labeled Nelson Mandela a terrorist. At the time, it was Cuba, I believe, who helped to liberate, was it Mozambique?
But it was Angola, and it's a long point.
Angola, not Mozambique.
And Namibia,
yes.
Namibia's independence. And
Namibia,
Cuba's
right.
engagement with Africa. And in fact, I have to say this. I just there's a collection coming out, Bridges of Solidarity, right?
Yes.
Coming out from Aaron Randall Press. That's coming out lately, and I was asked to contribute something on Cuba, right? So the issue is that Africa has occupied a privileged position in Cuban foreign policy, right? A privileged position. And so has Haiti, I might add. I'll come back to Haiti in a second. A privileged position, right? And they've often spoken about the fact that humanity owes a debt to Africa. So Cuba's, the first contingent of internationalist contributors, like there was a medical mission they sent to Algeria of doctors to help the Algerians, right, in their liberation struggle from the French. And as people know that struggle, over 1 million people were killed by the French as Algeria struggled for independence. But Cuba also supported other liberation struggles throughout Africa, and particularly in Guinea-Bissau, Angola, and Mozambique. In fact, Amilcar Cabral, the great Amilcar Cabral, said, and I'm just paraphrasing here, but he said, like, I don't believe in life after death, but I know that that our ancestors are rejoicing that our children and grandchildren have returned to Africa to help us in our liberation. And he said that to Fidel in 1966 when Fidel was visiting Guinea-Bissau, right? And then Cuba developed a relationship with the liberation movements in Angola. And when South Africa brazenly invaded Angola in 1975, right, in order to stop the Angola from becoming independent, and in a sense, they felt threatened, right? Because we're coming up to the 50th anniversary of the Soweto uprising this June, and people fail to often don't realize that what was going on in the liberation struggles in Mozambique and Angola at the time, right, had a significant impact on the consciousness of young Black South Africans. They would shout slogans, right, of the liberation movements and so forth. So when Angola was on the verge of becoming independent, South Africa invaded because they worried about the illegal occupation of Namibia and so forth. And at that moment when the South Africans invaded, and it was an existential moment for Angola's independence, the Angolans issued international SOS, and Cuba, and they particularly asked Cuba to send assistance. And Cuba already had military advisors, right, and so forth. There, they dispatched combat troops, and eventually climbing to 36,000. And actually, played a significant role in defeating the South Africans and pushing them out of Angola, such to the point that people don't realize that it basically reverberated inside South Africa. There were celebrations among Black South Africans, right? The largest Black South African newspaper at that time, until it was banned, The World, spoke about Black South Africans tasting the heady wine of liberation, right? And even in white South African newspapers, they spoke about how invigorated Black South Africans were by the struggle. And I don't think it's a coincidence that as these regional struggles outside of South Africa unfolded, right, you had a number of strikes and the struggle actually increasing in tempo inside South Africa itself. And even the Truth and Reconciliation of South Africa acknowledges that the war for the liberation of Black South Africans, right, inside South Africa itself, was a struggle waged not just inside the country itself, but in Southern Africa, in Angola, in Mozambique, and that tens of thousands of more people died outside the borders of South Africa than inside. And so South Africa waged from 1975 to 1988 a war of terror, okay, that killed millions of people, caused billions of dollars worth of damage. The Cubans stayed in Southern Africa, okay, and in a series of battles that I won't go into length about in 1987, 1988, centered around the legendary town of Cuito Valley, the South Africans racist defense forces, or racist armed forces, hard to call them defense forces when they were waging this war of terror, were dealt a decisive blow that basically changed the balance of power in the region, led to the immediate secured Angola's independence, led to the immediate independence of Namibia, and accelerated the end of apartheid. And it's no coincidence that one of the first countries outside of Africa that Mandela wanted to go through and went to was Cuba.
It was in Cuba, yeah.
And he delivered a speech where he said the Cuban internationalists have made a contribution to African independence, freedom, and so forth, that is unparalleled, right, and so forth. So Cuba's made this thing. Over 400,000 Cubans served, not as only as soldiers, but as doctors and teachers during this immense mission from 1975 to 1991, and over 2,000 died, right? So they made this incredible contribution and so forth. And I mentioned Haiti as well. Cuba has always saw a parallel between their experience, right? The fact that the United States has attempted to strangle them and is trying to strangle them at this moment, right? And what happened to Haiti for two reasons. One, because they dared throw off the yoke of the imperial masters, and also they dared, as Haiti did, to assist other countries, because people often forget that the Haitian revolutionaries made common cause with the liberation struggles against Spanish colonialism in Latin America, and that Bolivar spent some time in Haiti, right? And in fact was given resources and so forth. So Africa and Haiti have a privileged place in Cuba's pantheon.
And I want to talk about, both Kamala Prasad-Bissessa's comments and Irfan Ali's talking about, and she said it at the CARICOM meeting, really lecturing CARICOM leaders, oh, you all have capitalism and democracy here, but Cuba has communism and this and that. And they went to Mar-a-Lago or wherever they were in this right-wing summit, and they repeated the same things, that the status quo cannot remain in Cuba, and Cuba needs democracy and all of that. And the irony of this, there are two ironies here, and there are two hypocrisies here that I think I want you to highlight. One has to do with the relations, the very deep diplomatic relations that both Guyana and Trinidad has with the People's Republic of China, a communist country, as well as the contradiction between this idea of democracy and the United States support of right-wing dictatorships around the world, including the apartheid regime of South Africa. The United States supported the apartheid regime of South Africa for decades. They were okay with a white dictatorship in South Africa. And they're okay with what they did with Salvador Allende in Chile. But go ahead, please.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, and the current U.S. ambassador to South Africa is somebody who actually supported apartheid.
Correct, which was not a democracy.
It's insane. No, but the whole point about this is, first and fundamental is this issue is one, it's up for the Cuban people to determine their political, economic, and social systems without external interference, right? So my question is, and this is the point I should have made earlier too, is by standing with Trump and standing with Rubio, right, and uttering all of this stuff in Mar-a-Lago, right, they are basically contributing to the destruction of the architecture of international law. As imperfect as it was, okay, as limited as it was, right? and perhaps as impotent as it was it's a very important shield for mitigating the impact of imperial powers, particularly in countries of the global south. It protects us in some way, at least symbolically, right? And so they've thrown that into the dustbin of history, right? Okay, particularly the idea that basically, it's the right of self-determination, and that it's up to a people to determine without external interference what their political, economic, and social system should be. But it's clear from the 2025 national security strategy of Trump, probably the most, shall we say, perused national security strategy ever, that it's clear that not only do they want to intervene and control Latin America, they want to effectively to the minute detail determine who runs these particular countries, right? And so, of course, they're there where Trump is eviscerating whatever democratic rights exist in the United States. He's eviscerating them right, left, and center, violating the Constitution, violating international law. They sign deals with communist China, but they can't sign, as you pointed out, but they're criticizing Cuba. There's relations with all kinds of dictatorial regimes like Saudi Arabia and so forth that the U.S. has, and yet they're pontificating about democracy and so on. And I'd make the point, and we probably don't have time here, and I'd make the point here that that's a caricature of Cuba. I would argue that through my research, through my many visits there and research of other scholars, there's a lot of public participation in Cuba on critical issues of the direction of society and the economy. The Constitution went through a massive public consultation where articles were changed and so forth. Issues on the economic plan. When you're passing a new law, there's tremendous public participation. But of course, all of this is constrained by the massive material constraints that Cuba faces because of the economic war waged against it, right? When it comes to Guyana and Trinidad, I'm not surprised that the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago has said these things. I mean, I think this has always been an ideological frame of reference, right? So I'm not surprised, right? As my friend and colleague in Trinidad, Ako Muktota points out, he's not surprised. That was always her politics. People may have been confused when she was in opposition, and they had and then there was a People's Partnership that led to coming to power before she was rolled out. That and the trade unions supported her, and then they were surprised she was so anti-worker. This was always part and parcel of an ideological makeup.
But trade unions, the UNC has always had a history of progressivism.
But she herself comes out of something very different, right? Okay. And so forth. And the UNC really wasn't the United Labor Front, right? So in the 70s, if we know, when the United Labor Front emerges, it's really out of this, revolutionary ferment that's in Trinidad at the time. You had so many revolutionary groups that emerged after the 1970 Black Power Uprising, the February Revolution, whichever term we want to give it. And there were all these revolutionary groups that came out to ask, well, why didn't we take power? And there were a whole number of them, right? All sort of ideological persuasions within that broad cloak of Marxism, right? And the United Labor Front emerged sort of as a social democratic or electoral front for some of these groups. And there were very progressive things were said. But the UNC represented, I think, a fundamental departure from what the United Labor Front was and what Basdeo Panday represented at one point in his life in the 1970s, right? And Camille Bessessa, I think her politics and her ideological framework was also very neoliberal and so forth. Irfan Ali, unfortunately, coming from the PPP, coming from the party that's so, shall we say, soaked in the legacy of Chedi Jagan, it really represents even more, as you pointed out, jarring betrayal of principle and so forth, and about turn, right? But, people are opportunistic. There's economic and political gain to be made, and they're willing to abandon Cuba, right? And I think this will go down, this will be ignominious. And I think, one of the things nobody can predict the future, right? Okay. But I think it's very, very possible that Cuba will survive this. And in fact, I think, some of Trump's talking about, we're going to hit Cuba next. Lindsey Graham saying we're going to hit Cuba, after Iran. Some people even say they might hit them in trying to invade during this particular time. There's all sorts of stories appearing in the American press of Trump having told Miguel Diaz-Canel, you better get out of town. We hear all sorts of talks that there are negotiations going on behind closed doors, which I don't think are happening. All this sort of stuff speaks to a certain level of desperation because the Cubans have shown a greater level of perseverance, right, than they expected. For example, in your previous discussion, where you were talking about solar power and so forth, the Cubans are now producing well over up close to 38%, even more of their of electricity through solar power, and they're basically installing a whole series of photovoltaic stations, right, to basically begin this transition to away from fossil fuels for the energy supplies. Right? That doesn't solar energy isn't fuel. You can't drive cars with them. This is the big issue for Cuba of transport, of people getting to work, people getting to medical hospitals, people getting food from the farms, right? But I think this also speaks to the fact that Cuba is showing a greater deal of resilience than people expected. And more importantly, if they survive through this crisis, right? Okay, the ignominy of this betrayal will be even greater underscored. But I think there's also another point that needs to be drawn out here, and I think we mentioned the doctors, right? Okay, leaving various countries as well, right? Jamaicans. Yeah. What's going to be the impact on the people who these doctors were treating? There were people posting pictures of elderly seniors and elderly people, right? Okay, from very poor neighborhoods in Jamaica, right? Okay, in long lineups in the hot sun, waiting to see a doctor, right? So these leaders are willing to abandon the well-being and welfare of their own people, their own citizens, to placate the United States and so forth, right? But of course, as one person pointed out, when they get sick, they have the wherewithal to fly off to the United States to get the highest level of treatment and so forth. What happens to their citizens? What's going to be the impact on these citizens as well, right? So I think there's a multifaceted layer to this level of betrayal, from the very higher levels of what does it mean for Caribbean sovereignty, to self-determination, for pan-Caribbean unity. What does it mean for these geopolitical transformations that are unfolding, that Trump is trying to forestall and will probably inevitably not be able to do so? And what does this basically mean for the well-being of their own citizens, the poorest of the poor, who now won't have access to a very critical service such as healthcare?
And of course, finally, where do we go from here? Of course, we understand that they have really ramped up the pressure on Cuba. It clearly is a regime change effort here. But in the meantime, you've articulated that there are folks who are stepping up to the plate. You reference flotillas and things like that. But I'm not, and I want you to talk about that, but I'm not hearing from Russia and China or Vietnam, or what are they doing to come? I mean, China released a statement about, solidarity with Venezuela when what occurred there, but they did nothing. Russia did nothing. So who is to say that if the U.S. were to decide tomorrow, if this guy gets up and he's in a bad mood, that today we're going to invade Cuba to distract from the Epstein files, right? Okay, what will that look like?
Yeah. So on the point, I'll talk about the solidarity movement, right? Yes. So there's a flotilla, international flotilla that's going to be arriving in Cuba next week. It's solidarity, people coming from Mexico and other parts of the Caribbean, other parts of the world. They're basically bringing aid to challenge the blockade, right? To challenge this economic war against Cuba. I'm also an executive of the Canadian Network on Cuba. And we are sending containers down to Cuba of medical supplies and generators. We just sent 80 EcoFlow generators down to Cuba. There's all sorts of money that's flooding into us from Canadians who are basically interested in supporting Cuba. So we're doing that stuff to sort of help Cuba in what way we can. We're also carrying on political work here. Basically, we have a petition, a parliamentary petition that the Canadian government has to respond to, that's gained over 11,000 signatures as we speak, calling on Canada not only to condemn the U.S. economic blockade, but to take concrete measures supporting Cuba, even sending oil and so forth. Now, Mexico is continuing to send humanitarian aid to Cuba. Now, the thing about China and Russia, for example, is I don't know what's going on behind the scenes, right? But I know that China's provided considerable money for Cuba to upgrade its electrical grid, as well as it has provided 5,000 2-kilowatt photovoltaic installations to Cuba. That Cuba is now installing 5,000 2-kilowatt photovoltaic installations that Cuba is now installing. Vietnam and China has also sent 60,000 60,000 tons of rice to Cuba. And so the point is, I don't know what's going on behind the scenes. That may be all they're doing, but I would suspect that there's a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes as well, right? Because it's important to understand. There was a meeting of the ambassador, right, of Canada, and we were talking about what was going on. And he's not going to say stuff, and he made it very clear that some things we can't say because the United States will intervene to sabotage, right? So what China is attempting to do at this moment, at least what I can see, what's public, is help Cuba to upgrade its electrical grid system, and also to basically have a significant move, and is accelerate their move to solar energy. In one of your previous segments, it was mentioned that one of the advantages that a country like China has over, people who are worried about whether they're going to be elected 5 years from now, is to plan 50 years into the future. Cuba has elections, and Diaz-Canal's term will be coming to an end at some point. But Cuba actually has a plan for 2100 to 2100, right? To basically deal with climate change. It's a very detailed plan as well, right? And that's part and parcel of what they're accelerating in the move and so forth. Now, the question is, if the US were to intervene militarily, I think there's very little China and Russia can do, right? Okay. And there's a famous story, if I may share this anecdote with you,
Sure.
in the 1980. In 1980, Raul Castro, who was then the defense minister of Cuba, travels to Moscow. And he's told by the leadership in Moscow of the Soviet Union at that time that, listen, we publicly have stated that we will defend you if the United States attacks you. But in reality, don't expect us to travel halfway around the world and get our asses kicked. We won't be able to do that. We commit to publicly saying we will defend you. Okay, but don't expect that to happen, right? So Raul Castro travels back to Cuba, has a meeting with Fidel Castro, and tells him this, right? And then they have a meeting with the Politburo, and Fidel Castro says, listen, the defense minister is giving me a piece of information that is so incredibly sensitive that we would like your permission just to keep it between the two of us, right? And this was known as the Pandora case, right? And so in a sense, I think China and Russia will provide diplomatic assistance. I think there's a lot of material aid that's coming in that we don't know about, okay? But if the United States were to intervene, right, I think there's very little that they can do. But the Cubans will fight. And I think one of the important points to bear in mind is that there were more U.S. casualties, right, when they went in to take Maduro than as actually were acknowledged, and those casualties came from the Cubans resisting, and in fact, the U.S. even acknowledges that they fought like lions.
Well, we would never know because we live in an age of misinformation. It's not like I always make the point that history does not repeat itself, but it rhymes.
Yeah.
And but this period is just very interesting and tumultuous.
It's very frightening. Right? It's like, for example, trying to figure out what's going on in the state of Hormuz, trying to figure out what's going on in this war in Iran, right? You don't know what's going on.
We don't because I suspect that the casualty count on the U.S. side might be greater than what they're telling us it is, really.
Yeah. And the issue for us is like, and I wrote a piece called "Cuba Must Not Fall: The Global Implications of the Cuban Revolution." Its importance and significance, right? Okay, and particularly for this region, right? If the Cuban Revolution is successfully crushed by the United States, right? Okay, we are entering a period, right, of recolonization, right, in everything but name of the entire region. What does this mean, right? And all the advances, right, of small countries we're just basically reduced to being pawns, to simply being factotums, right, and appendages of the whim of the U.S. imperial monster. Which is why the defense of Cuba, which is why its resilience has always been a critical component. And I always like to point out that even during a special period when Fidel Castro and other leaders said, we see our greatest internationalist duty to be to defend the Cuban Revolution, they were doing more than just surviving. They were hosting conferences, right? Looking at what was happening with neoliberalism, trying to build unity in action. And when the free trade area of the Americas was first shall we say, mooted, right? And people were trying to get the free trade of the Americas. Its death knell was sounded in a May Day rally by Fidel Castro, where he put forward the slogan, annexation no, a plebiscite yes, right? Okay. And that galvanized Latin American leaders at that time to reject the free trade area of the Americas, where it was seen as, in a sense, a recolonization, right? We're back at that moment again, right? And once again, Cuba is at the center of the struggle, right? But they're demonstrating a resilience. And it's not just the fact of Cuba surviving, it's also the survival of the ability to envision a different future, what we call a radical imagination, to envision that there can be a world that's different than this world we're living in, which I find so incredibly unsettling, so incredibly frightening, in which the outrages just seem endless, right, and unrelenting.
Professor Saini, thank you so much for appearing on this week's edition of the Bob Report. We will continue to watch the space. Of course, there are still, we did not even talk about this, but there are many Grenadian and Global South people studying in Cuba right now at the Cuba's finest medical institutions, for free, might I add, for free. Okay? So I just wanted to put that out there. Cuba does not request anything in return. So I think that point must be made. But thank you again. We'll be watching the space to see how everything unfolds. But thank you for putting in context everything we have been seeing in the context of Trinidad, Guyana.
Yeah, thank you. I think you've summed it up better than I could have. It's so succinct, so powerful, and right to the point. And it's always a privilege and honor to be on your show.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Professor. Viewers and listeners, Professor Isaac Saini, he was here to have a conversation and react to the continued pressure campaign by Washington to really decapitate the regime in Havana, and of course the very historic regime. And of course this is happening against the backdrop of the anniversary of Grenada's own March 13, 1979 revolution, which was observed on the 13th of March this year as well. Of course, there is a Grenada-Cuba Friendship Society in Grenada, and I suspect uppermost in the minds of those who are part of that era is everything that's unfolding right now in the region with respect to Cuba, especially and spectacularly the betrayal of Guyana. Given Guyana's history, given the progressive history of the political party in Guyana that is now led by its president, of course, they have historically had strong ties with Cuba. And to see that betrayal was indeed extremely spectacular and astounding to see. So folks, what we want to do now is to take a quick break, and we'll return for the second segment of the program. Please stand by for that. Hi everyone. The Bob Report is committed to being fearless, balanced, and independent, bringing you the stories that matter most without compromise. Now do us a favor. Remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Hit the bell so you never miss an update. You can also watch us on GBN TV every Wednesday at 5 p.m. Catch us on WPG10 television every Sunday at 8 p.m. Your support helps us to keep journalism free from bias and influence. And together, we can make sure every voice is heard and every fact is verified. Thanks for watching.
Should your loved ones pass on, they deserve to be treated with dignity. And at S.A. Johnson Funeral,
welcome you back to this week's edition of the Bob Report. Of course, we're going to get straight into this conversation now that we're having on the economic fallout from the ongoing U.S. war against Iran. And of course, the economic fallout includes factors such as shipping, insurance, includes factors such as, of course, the cost of fuel at the pumps, and of course, and the spin-off effects that results from that. And we're happy to be joined by this segment with entrepreneur Mr. Chris Diali. Of course, he sat in the Grenada Senate as the business representative. He's been an entrepreneur for many years in Grenada, as well as Professor Don Charles, who is an energy economist. Of course, Dr. Charles, we haven't seen you in a while, but the last time you were here, I believe it was during the COVID pandemic, sir. And of course, we were having a conversation on energy back then, as well as inflation. It seems that, you always come here whenever there is a crisis, but this particular crisis seems to be extremely cataclysmic, and we think it's important that for the folks in Grenada and the Caribbean, that they ought to know what the spin-off effects of that will be. So, Professor Charles, I want to begin with you. Now, let us talk about crude oil. Let us talk about oil and energy. under normal circumstances, what market forces determine, crude oil prices and so on? And of course, we know that we have OPEC and all of that. And under normal circumstances, you have different price structures, but of course, these are not normal times. So let's have a conversation about that first and foremost.
Okay. So good day, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Bob, for the warm introduction and the invitation to come again on your channel, on your show.
Yes.
So yes, I can speak about oil prices and what actually determine oil prices and so forth, but I'll give a slight context given the situation that we're actually dealing with right about now. Just to start. So we know recently, let's say February 27th, oil prices was $60 a barrel, $67 a barrel. WTI oil prices was at such price, and the market closed at that price. And over the weekend, there were some hostilities. Now, I'm not talking politics in terms of, I'm not saying, I'm not supporting or criticizing the actions of any country. There were some hostilities in the Middle East area, and as a result of the hostilities, the armed conflict, there was an increase in oil prices. When the market opened, it opened at $75 a barrel. And so if the market closed at, let's say, $67 and opened at $75, it opened at a jump. Now, yes, I will speak about the terms of oil prices, but I just want to give a slight context in terms of a jump, in terms of the financial.
Absolutely.
So in terms of the financial economics literature, a jump really refers to a situation when there's a significant increase in the price of an asset over a relatively short period of time. And that literally was the case for oil prices. So it over the past 2 years or so, oil prices was fluctuating around the $6 per barrel range. And then it just closed at one price and then opened at $75, which is a significant increase for a relatively short period of time. So you want to ask yourself, why? Why did oil increase in such a short period of time? Well, there are several demand-side factors and there are several supply-side factors that actually determine the price of oil. So in normal conditions, what determines the price of oil in terms of a demand-side factor would be, one of the things is refinery fractions. So yes, this is an economics term, but refinery fractions in layman terms, what this really means is the refined products from an oil refinery. Meaning this, that you refine oil into, let's say, diesel, gasoline, aviation fuel, heating oil, so forth. These different refining products are used, they are produced from the refining of oil, and of course they are used for different purposes. They are used for fuel, they are used for, like, let's say, energy, electricity production, and so forth. So one of the factors driving demand is the demand for the different refining fractions. So that's one factor. Another factor is, let's say, the demand, I would say the income or the output of major countries, like major countries meaning the developed countries. So we see countries like in Europe, countries like, let's say, in America, Canada, so forth. These countries are major economies. They have a lot of economic activity, and they are also major consuming economies. So what happens is that when there's strong economic activity and there's generally a growth in national income in these countries, there will be an increase in consumption, there will be an increase in demand for electricity production, and generally speaking, there will be an increase in demand for oil in these countries. So generally speaking, the economic prosperity, the output, the economic growth of these countries tends to have a positive impact upon oil prices, generally speaking, under normal conditions. And also in terms of another demand side factor would be weather conditions. And this is relatively straightforward because we have periods of time which is relatively cold, like the winter, and you have periods of time which is relatively hot, like the summer. So in the winter, there will be an increase in demand for electricity generation, for like heating, and the same thing works for, like, let's say, the summer, where there's an increase in energy demand, electricity demand for air conditioning. So generally speaking, there's seasonality in terms of the demand for oil because of the different weather conditions. So that's the demand side factors. Now we are moving to the supply side factors, which is actually the source of the problems we actually face
of the issue right now. Correct. Yes.
The supply side factors. So under normal circumstances, what a key supply side factor would be the supply of oil in major oil producing countries. So we know that we have countries like, let's say, the OPEC countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, and so forth. We also have Russia, which is a major oil producing country. Generally speaking, the supply in these countries, supply of the production capacity in these countries tends to affect the supply or availability or oil in market. That's under normal conditions.
Mhm.
Now, another key factor that affects the supply, it would be weather conditions. And this is relatively straightforward because let's say you have a hurricane, you have a tropical cyclone, some adverse weather event, and it negatively affect production in some major oil producing country. Obviously, they will have a disruption in supply, and when you have a disruption in supply, basic demand supply economics, it will cut demand at a higher point, you won't have an increase in price, generally speaking. Another key supply side factor would be inventories of the oil inventories of major producing countries. And this is especially the case for the US because the US tend to stockpile oil inventory. So they tend to have oil inventories, not to regulate the market, but to act as a buffer to cushion against unfavorable high increases in oil prices, generally speaking. So help to cushion their market. So another key factor that affects oil prices is armed conflict. And we are actually witnessing a situation right about now. So in armed conflict, especially armed conflict involving key oil producing countries, what tends to happen, now I'm not supporting or criticizing any country's action, but what the reality is, what happens is that we tend to see different actors attack key economic investment and key or strategic infrastructure. They attack oil refineries, they attack, let's say, oil production facilities like rigs and so forth. And when you have these things taking place, obviously you will have a disruption in production. When you have a disruption in production, you will have, let's say, an increase in prices. But in terms of armed conflict, it's both a supply side effect and a demand side effect. Demand side effect, and it's really arising out of the context that we live in right about now. So we live in a period of time where when countries fight war, they use a lot of, let's say, vehicles to fight war. So you have the airplanes, you have the ships, you have the military vehicles that travel on land, the tanks and so forth. And these vehicles essentially require fuel to operate. So there will be an increasing demand for fuel to operate these vehicles. So there's a demand side effect as well that occurs, that drives the increase in price when armed conflicts break out, especially among major oil producing countries. Now, in terms of the economic textbooks, right, the economics literature, when I was in class as a student some years ago, 20 years ago, they will not have emphasized this point, but this is an important point. One of the important factors that affect the price of oil would be key transportation routes. And key transportation routes, and I'll give you the context of this current situation. The Strait of Hormuz is a key strategic route, transit route, connecting the Indian Ocean to that, I think it's the Persian Gulf. And what happens is that about, let's say, 20 to 30% of the world's oil supply actually transit through this narrow passageway. And what will happen is that by blocking the Strait of Hormuz, what will happen is that you cause, like, let's say, some kind of bottleneck. Many countries are not able to access oil or the oil supplies as previously able to access. And what will happen, they will cause an increase in price. And this will be to the case of many countries. Now, this has significant implications. So there's a price implication, there's supply side implications, there's even implications for countries like in the Caribbean, right? So
I mean, and so this is the question, and I do want to bring in Mr. Diali here on this. But the Strait of Hormuz is over there. Again, I'm pleading ignorance here. I don't know. I suspect most of their freight is oriented towards the Middle East. So why, therefore, would we have a price shock over here if that shipping is oriented towards that part of the world? Again, I'm a layman. I'm just speaking from the perspective of a layman. Dr. Charles, and I'll get to Mr. Diali on that question.
So what will happen? So you have shipping. The reality is that, yes, you have a disruption in shipping. And apart from oil being one of the commodities that passes through this route, that transits through this route, there are other commodities, agricultural commodities, there are goods that are also being supplied through this route. What will happen is that it's not just an oil supply side bottleneck. There's a good supply side bottleneck. Many goods are not able to transit through this route, and what will happen, there will generally be an increase in cost because one, you'll have an increase, there'll be delays. There'll be delays in terms of consumers getting the good. There'll be shortage. Generally speaking, this point towards inflationary pressure. So apart from the fact that yes, we have increases in oil prices. Yes, we want to have increases in the refining fraction prices, which will push up fuel prices, which will cause an increase in electricity costs for the oil importing countries. You also want to see an increase in the cost of, you tend to will see inflationary pressures almost worldwide because of supply chain bottlenecks. The reality is that, although yes, that is the other side of the world, but the reality is that we live in an interconnected world, and major
This is also true.
macroeconomic events that affect any region in one part of the world tend to have spillover effects to other part of the world, So the reality is that we are all interconnected. So it's like the saying that we're all in one ship. You have a leak in one side of the ship, and we're in the other side of the ship. And the reality is that leaking in one side of the ship will eventually affect you. And this is literally the case right about now, because of the inflationary effects that will occur as a consequence of this armed conflict. The whole world economy will be affected. So as long as this conflict is ongoing, you see military, you see different major economic infrastructures being attacked, destroyed, and so forth. People are being killed, and all these kind of things taking place. It is very risky being across there. You tend to will see inflationary pressures. This is almost an immediate effect as a consequence of the armed conflict.
Mr. Diali, of course, in your experience, I suspect you have experienced while you were in business, Gulf War I. Of course, there was the Iraq War back in 2004. And again, all of those centered in that part of the world. In your experience, and of course, we also have to make the point that the global economy is much more integrated now. You have China as a much bigger player now than they were, even back with Iraq War in 2003, 2004, even back with the first Gulf War. Let us pick up on what Dr. Charles said here in respect of those spill-off effects that you articulated on a news broadcast in Grenada as well. Let's talk about those.
Well, Dr. Charles is correct in that the constraints that we face from the Straits of Hormuz being blocked off or sealed off by Iran based on what is happening now and the war is that there will be shortage in supplies of oil and so on. But the major thing for us is goods to the Caribbean. Once the goods, boats have stopped going through the major lines like Kajima and so on, instructed their ships to hold until they understand what is happening. And there is an issue of safety for the ships and the people on the ship. Yeah. So if Iran continues to mine the waters through the Straits of Hormuz, the issue is going to be, why should I take the risk? Why should shipping lines take the risk to move goods through that shipping line? Now, we could always say that we could choose another route, come around the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, and that in itself is another route that could be used, but it's the cost to move in goods and services around that Cape. So anyhow we look at it, once this war, and I want to make this point carefully, this war with Iran and the US and Israel, it really depends on how long this war is going to go for. Some pundits have expressed the fact that if we don't stop this thing immediately, the effects, as Dr. Charles indicated, worldwide is going to be significant. Inflationary prices on goods and what is happening there, because as we know, we need oil and natural gas to work in certain industries to produce what they produce. So for us in the Caribbean, I always say is inflated imported inflation.
Imported inflation, yes, imported
that
inflation.
That we have no
correct.
real say and what we do with that, because we are net importing countries. So it is going to be challenging times for us as we move ahead. And if the US and Israel cannot bring this to a conclusion, the longer it takes is the more drastic we'll see. Dr. Charles said the price of oil jumped significantly, about 10% from a closing to an opening. And that is significant because the trading of West Texas crude and all of these things affect all of us. And of course, the futures as it relates to oil, where they expect as tensions and risk factors taken into account to determine price. And we are seeing some people predicting $120 a barrel and could be more. the impact for us
Yeah.
in the Caribbean is going to be severe if that continues.
So right now it looks like, and of course that was 3 days ago, it was like $109. But I do want to bring back Dr. Charles here. Dr. Charles, let us talk about, of course, we know that a significant chunk of the world's crude oil comes from that part of the world, whether it's Iran. Of course, Iran was sanctioned, but that did not stop them from trading, for example, with China, right? That did not stop them from trading with China at all. You have Saudi Arabia, then you have the other Gulf states, you have Oman, and things like that. But looking at the Western Hemisphere and the context of, say, Guyana now has a significant windfall of energy supply, as well as Venezuela, right? Now that they have, engaged in regime change over there. And again, not wanting you to comment on the politics of it, as you said you wouldn't, but can these two countries in South America, as oil exporters, in some way, have the ability to fill that gap? And if they cannot, why not? In the context of the entire global oil market, how does that work?
All right. Okay. So I will first speak briefly about the oil prices. Then I will directly answer your questions. So
Yes.
You're correct. Monday, oil prices went as high as $120 a barrel. That's WTI oil prices, West Texas Intermediate. Now, the average layman, when they hear oil prices rise, and they think that they hear like oil prices jump to $120 a barrel, the average person think that oil price will rise, it will go up, it will stay and reach a particular level, and it will stay at that particular level. But in terms of how the financial market works, it doesn't really work like that. The market fluctuates. It goes up, it goes down. So it went up to $120 a barrel, and there was some form of market correction. It went back down. So if you look at the chart, if you look at the candlesticks chart, so what you'll see a whipsaw candlestick chart pattern where you'll see a jump, strong movement up, and almost next two candlesticks there will be strong movement backwards. There will be some kind of market correction. This is normal. The oil market is volatile. Volatile in this context means it fluctuates a lot. It's mark to market daily. It fluctuates on almost a daily basis. And it fluctuates due to speculation because you have a lot of people on the market that are trading on the market and they're trying to profit from changes in the price of the market. So you have people on the market that don't really care about oil in terms of they don't really want the oil to actually make gasoline. They don't want the oil for any energy supply. They just want to make money from changing the price of the asset. And you have a lot of people like that on the market trying to profit from changing the price. And you have a lot of people trading on the market and causing speculative action, which is actually driving a lot of the volatility we see on the market right about now. Now, within the regional context, in terms of the Caribbean, we have countries like, let's say, we have Guyana, we have Trinidad, because I'm from Trinidad and Tobago. We produce some amount of oil. And we also have a country like, let's say, Venezuela. Now, in terms of Venezuela production has been on a significant decline. So, I mean, yes, they had some problems and they had some of their infrastructure is relatively old and so forth. So, in terms of, yes, they have significant oil reserves, but in terms of the production, the actual production right about now, it's relatively low compared to what it could be if they have, let's say, better infrastructure and better investment, so to say. So, in terms of, let's say, looking towards Venezuela to help increase oil supply to cushion the impact on oil prices, they have the reserves to do that, but they currently do not have the production to do that. So that's the difference. Now, in terms of Guyana is emerging as a potential powerhouse in terms of the oil industry. They have significant reserves and their production is increasing on an annual basis. Now, if you look at Trinidad and Tobago, at that point in time, Trinidad and Tobago produced almost about 15 years ago, Trinidad and Tobago produced, like, let's say, about over 100,000 barrels of oil per day. And right now it's down to about, let's say, about 40,000 barrels of oil per day. And Guyana could be something like around over 600,000 barrels of oil per day. So, I mean, you see, Trinidad and Tobago output is very small relative to Guyana.
Compared to Ghana, yeah.
Compared to Guyana. But even if we factor in Guyana as an individual player right about now, their output cannot, let's say, cushion the impact on oil prices right about now. as Caribbean countries, right about almost all the Caribbean countries, in almost all industries, we are price takers. There's the world price. The world price is being affected by global demand and supply side conditions. And what happens is that you are a price taker. You have to accept what price that is set by the local market. But what you can do is that you control your output. You can try to produce as much as you can and try to maximize your revenue by producing output, not by having a direct impact on price. So in terms of cushioning the impact, Guyana directly cannot cushion the global impact on oil prices right about now. Trinidad certainly cannot cushion the global impact of oil prices right about now. What can happen is that they can cushion the impact if they had refineries, and if they had operating refineries, they can cushion the impact within their country. Now, we have a situation in Trinidad that we have an oil refinery that is being mothballed right about now, that's closed down. So Trinidad and Tobago is not refining oil right about now. But in the event there was a refinery that was in operation, what could have happened for Trinidad and Tobago? We could have produced oil, we could have refined oil, and the oil would have been used on the local market in Trinidad and Tobago, and that would have insulated Trinidad and Tobago completely from any fluctuation in oil prices. However, right about now, Trinidad and Tobago exports oil, the raw oil, the unrefined oil, and Trinidad and Tobago imports refined products. So we import gasoline, we import diesel, and so forth. We import all our fuels right about now. So what will happen that although we are oil producer, we still will be impacted because we now have to import the products, the refining fractions, the higher price. So
the secondary products there, yeah.
Yes, so it's like a double-edged sword. On one hand, you will jump for joy and say, hey, we're getting more money from export because we're exporting oil at higher prices. But at the same point in time,
because would there not be a potential windfall for Trinidad here with the export of those products that might
potentially
would be able to fill the demand that we're no longer seeing from that part of the world?
So yes and no, in the sense that one Trinidad and Tobago's oil production is 40,000 barrels of oil per day is very small. That is almost no oil. On a global scale, that is next to nothing. So that's one. So the only person that could benefit from that side is Trinidad and Tobago to some extent. But to some extent, yes, but to some extent, no. Because in the sense that, yes, you can export, but in terms of Trinidad and Tobago's crude, you have the benchmark crude, like let's say WTI, you have Brent crude, but Trinidad and Tobago crude has let's say, it has a higher API content. So it's a heavier crude, and it has a higher sulfur content. So it's a more sour crude. So what this means in a layman terms, that it is more difficult to refine Trinidad and Tobago's oil. So yes, you have the benchmarks, but because it's more difficult to refine Trinidad and Tobago's oil, it does not get as high as a high price as, let's say, the traditional benchmark like WTI or Brent. It gets like maybe a $5 or $10 off. It'll be slightly lower. So yes, you have bullish conditions, and yes, you'll get more money, but you will not get as much money as if you was exporting WTI. Nevertheless, you want to get some more export revenue on one hand from the exporting of oil, but you want to lose on the next hand because you now have to import refining products at a higher price. So you're winning with one hand, but you're also losing with the other hand here. So it's still important some amount of inflation. So it is a problem for Trinidad and Tobago to some extent, because the consumers, well, the government tends to insulate the prices. So even if it's important, the refining fractions at a higher cost, the consumers will not feel it immediately in Trinidad and Tobago, because the government of Trinidad and Tobago tends to insulate the impact of these volatile prices. They insulate the consumers from such an impact. But for the Caribbean, for the wider Caribbean, we have other Caribbean countries, and the government tends to not to shield the consumers as much. So for the average man, you almost will see almost immediately an increase at the pump for when you go by the pump to buy, let's say, gasoline or diesel. So you're going to experience an inflationary impact because of the increase in the price of fuel. That is almost so. As long as this armed conflict persists, and as long as the price starts to fluctuate and stay in this kind of bullish condition, so bullish meaning oil, like let's say in excess of $70 a barrel. So anything between $80 and $100 a barrel. Once oil remains around that range, you're going to see bullish market conditions, and the consumer will feel it they will feel it some way, somehow. As I like, if it's at the pump, we're going to feel it when you're importing products and you're going to have to pay higher prices for all the different products that you consume in your country. So there are going to be some inflationary effects.
Mr. Diali, I do remember in 2022, this current administration, of course, when they inherited government in 2022, you also had high prices. You had the post-COVID inflation period, yes? And I remember vividly that the government then, they removed all taxes on petrol. They also, I believe there was a cap on, I can't remember what the cap was on right now. It's escaping, but you probably remember. But they implemented some measures in this current environment. What fiscal measures, immediate fiscal measures, would you recommend that the government do? Because as we already know, inflation in Grenada is just insane, right? You go to every day you go to the supermarket, you see something, and you're like, whoa. Right, and it continues to increase. So, Mr. Diali, if you were in government shoes and advising them on temporary fiscal measures that can be taken, because at the end of the day, a private enterprise, they are going to pass on the cost to the consumer. That's just going to be the reality. So let's talk about that.
Well, is it for us in Grenada is a three-prong approach, because they have the cost of electricity, which uses diesel to generate. Then you have consumption at the fuel pumps. And what happens, the government does take a tax there. I think it was $3.50 on a gallon, and there's a range. And right now it is controlled, because what we have, they will see every 18th of the month, gas or diesel will go up or down depending on imported price at the supplier end. And they will hold cooking gas constant at $40 or £20. But the £100 also fluctuates. So for government, the challenge is going to be rare, in the sense that where can they control what they could control without much loss of revenue, because the taxes that the government collect on that for us in Grenada in transportation is huge in terms of our revenue intake. Grenlec, on the other hand, the sole electricity generation plant, they buy at a certain price, and they have to pass that on. They normally use an average over the period of time, and you get an average increase. In recent times, our electricity rates have increased because of the cost of oil being imported. With this prolonged situation, if it's prolonged with the war, you can expect that those areas will increase, and it will challenge government on what they could do and what fiscal measures they could use. On the goods side, on the importation of goods, we're in a construction boom now, and that requires a lot of importation of lumber and steel and all of that. The issue here is freight. And if the freight costs increase because of logistics to start with, and the cost of running a ship in terms of the fuel, you will see an immediate increase in freight, as we had years ago after COVID. So the issue for us is, and when the Kajimas and them levy these freight increases, there's very little we could do. The government in the past had tried to introduce a scheme where they could help with the freight of, had a 40-foot container moving from an average of 4,000 US to 10,000. Significant increases because of the risks and, of course, the cost of fuel. So if we go back to that, government, again, is going to be very limited on what they could do. So if I had to advise the government, of course, the analysis needs to be done and understand in two factors, short-term and medium to long, and what is going to happen with the war and how the country is going to impact. And I always said, and I said in another program, it has to start with the individual, in the sense that each individual need to understand how they could conserve their energy consumption. If you normally used to drive and go in various places a few times a day, you might have to cut that down to once or twice, because the cost for you is going to increase. Similarly, the goods that will see inflationary prices affect is going to have to look at what you buy, how you change your purchases, and then seriously consider wants versus needs. And Kellan, it is not an easy thing for an individual to change their socialization and what they do in times like this. It is going to impact. And for certain industries in Grenada, for example, like paint, and paint manufacturer. Paint manufacturer depends heavily on petrol products. And immediately, I know suppliers is going to start levying and having discussions, because we in that industry will try to put orders 3 to 6 months ahead. And if this war is prolonged, the change in prices are going to significantly affect those products. And business can't absorb all, they'll have to pass it on. And that is going to be the challenge, because consumption, of course, is going to drop when the price moves to a certain point. So it is multiple factors that is going to affect the country, and the government hands are tied to a certain extent in what fiscal measures they could use. You could say to the government, okay, widen the base for VAT and VAT percentages, and you could widen the base for basic food items, and instead of charging at 15% as it is now, you zero rate some of those items, but the government cannot continue that for long. And that is why I say again, the issue is how the war in terms of time is going to think, because it affects government, and government tends to operate on a principle of revenue neutrality. In other words, they try to equate what their revenues collection will be based on the costs that they have to meet in a recurrent budget and what is going to happen. So if you're in deficit, because of these increases that you're going to get over the period, it's going to be a very difficult time for the government.
Yes, Mr. Dialli, I lost your audio there, so give me 1 second. But I do want Mr. Charles to pick up on what you've heard Mr. Dialli say here. Is there anything that you want to piggyback on?
Well, I want to
the audio here.
Yeah, what I want to say is I totally agree with those points. The reality is that you have a government, any country, especially within the Caribbean region here, you have a government, and yes, you have a government have a responsibility to help maximize and protect the interests and the welfare of the people of its country. But at the same point in time, you need to consider macroeconomic factors. Yes, you might say you want to remove VAT on certain food products to make sure certain goods are accessible to the citizens of your country. But at the same point in time, the government have to balance its revenue, have to balance its expenditure. And when the government has, let's say, a revenue shortfall, if it maintains its expenditure constant, what will happen is eventually there will be some form of, let's say, budget deficit. And if this persists for too long, you will have an increase in government debt. And the reality is that indefinitely, no government can indefinitely spend more than what it earns. At some point in time, it has to pay it back. So a government needs to consider its fiscal balance. A government needs to consider its debt. And a government cannot allow its debt to grow too high, because when its debts grow too high, then you start to hear arguments of debt overhang and debt distress, where the debts at let's say, compromise economic growth, or the debt now, you're having problems servicing the debt, and you're on the verge of default. So you cannot allow yourself to reach those kind of situations. You really have to balance your long-term goals with the short-term problem that you're facing right about now. So the real question is really, how long will this conflict last? And the reality is that, yes, you can run an econometric model. You can run an econometric model and you can forecast oil prices, some kind of univariate model. It doesn't really matter which model you use. But the reality is that we have so much, let's say, geopolitics that are in play, that oil prices now is not being determined purely by past oil prices. Oil prices are being determined by major countries and the decisions that they are making. And reality is that nobody in Caribbean has any report or any manifesto, any kind of things telling them, say, here, this country plans to attack this other country, or they plan to attack this infrastructure for this period of time. So reality, we're operating in a vacuum, and that is reality that we're operating with. So I mean, it's a very challenging situation. Yes, you have to protect your people, but at the same point in time, you need to maintain stability. So in terms of any recommendation I'll make for any government, I would say the reality is that you have to let whatever price effects occurring, you have to let it pass on to consumer, because the reality is that you have to maintain macroeconomic stability, and you cannot allow that to balloon and reach unsustainable levels. So that is just the unfortunate reality.
Yeah, now one of the fiscal measures, Mr. Dialli, and I remember it now, the government placed a 6-month cap on freight. That was, I believe, from September 2022, thereabouts, is when it was implemented. Would something like that also be practical in this period as well? Because I mean, it seems to me that the economic conditions are I suppose favorable for implementing such a fiscal measure.
When they implemented it, I was a critique of it in the sense that what was passed on to the consumer and to the business wasn't really seriously thought out. Yes, you had these increases in freight, and based on what happened, the government was saying let's suspend or take less. But the issue is the shipping lines are the one that will determine what the cost of freight is, and you have very little negotiating power with the shipping lines. So that is part of the that's part of the problem. And for a business that to absorb from, let's say, 4,000 freight from a 40-foot to 10,000, and you look at that difference in freight costs, is how you're going to transfer that, or if you can absorb it over the product range that is going to affect. So there is that was tried in my view, but wasn't very effective. So the government obviously was going to have to, sit and really do a deep analysis, as Dr. Charles is saying, that if this thing is prolonged, what can we do in the short, medium, and so on? Because at the end of the day, the inflation that's going to come in both on the goods side and on the fuel side in particular is going to affect us. I mean, as you say, Kellan, when you go to the supermarket from one day to the next, you see prices of things move significantly. I mean, the average in Grenada in inflation is around 3%, 2 to 3% or less, based on what was put out recently. But when you look at that, government just negotiated increases with public servants, and they gave some, some significant increases, 13% over 3 years, and so on. That was another challenge for the government, because where are you going to get the revenue to service that? Dr. Charles talked about debt, but there's a debt in its own right, locally and internally, to meet salaries and wages every month. So there are going to be, it's unfortunate that this has happened, but is how we navigate it. And I keep going back to the point that all of us have to sit and watch what we do as consumers and try and adjust where we can, because our salary scales and what we do there is far different to what is going to happen on the expense side. It's going to move faster than what your revenues is going to move. That is the norm. So the only way to have control is to, you as an individual, mitigate and look at your expenses and see where you can you can control and have more revenue available for you to deal with necessities that you must have.
Now, Dr. Charles, there is a conversation in Grenada right now about the basket of goods and how expensive things are. And the conversation is happening against the backdrop, but the government needs to do more, for example, to really treat with those issues in the basket of goods, right? To treat with the cost of them. That the government should look at perhaps reducing VAT on some items. I mean, I suspect, of course, you're not in the Grenada context, but I suspect many other Caribbean countries are also toying with ways in which they can treat with this. But realistically, how much can one do in the context of a country where you are so heavily import dependent, right? So let's hear your thoughts on that. If you were advising any government in the region to ameliorate the pressure that consumers are facing, that their constituents are facing, what advice would you be giving them against this broader macroeconomic picture that we see?
Yeah, so that's a very good question, and it's not a problem that is unique to Grenada. That's almost like a Caribbean regional-wide problem. I'm living in Trinidad, and we have that problem right about now in this country. You go to the grocery, and then you just see prices of everything going up. So there are things that you can do. So you have one side, you have a government, and you have VAT, and yes, there's always a temptation to say, government, let's zero it, the VAT on a wide range of products, or let's even subsidize some products. And it's easy to say supply that, but because I have training in debt and I understand the implications of macroeconomic stability, I will never tell any government to, let's say, remove VAT completely on a wide range of food of any products. And I would never say to government to go on, let's say, a policy where it's subsidizing a wide range of products, because these policies has long-term implications for government expenditure. Government expenditure is sticky downwards, and the reality is that when you're reaching a debt overhang situation, is a real big problem that causes instability and debt distress. That is a problem by itself, and you're really trying to avoid that problem before it comes. Really and truly, what you really need to do is to have some kind of, like, let's say, industrial policy and productive policies to increase your local productive capacity. So I remember that CARICOM had a plan, and CARICOM had a plan to become, let's say, food independent by I think 2025. I think they now change the plan to achieve the target by 2030, and this is relatively a low-hanging fruit. So we import out of products, we import out of food products, and yes, but you can have a lot of local production. Take, for instance, we are living in a time where there's hydroponics, there's aquaponics. There are a lot of these different climate-smart agriculture techniques where you don't need to have a large farm, a large field. You can have some kind of a small area, closed area, and you employ the different techniques, these hydroponics and aquaponic techniques, and you can have a large amount of production in a relatively small area. You need to have a lot of these different projects to empower small-scale farmers to help produce, let's say, local agriculture output, to help increase local food supply, to help make a country less food dependent, especially on imports. So that's one thing that can be done. And this is actually a low-hanging fruit. This can be achieved, especially for a wide range of, like, let's say, short-term crops. Now, in the context of, let's say, electricity generation, if a country is importing diesel for the generation of electricity, there's very limited thing you could actually do in the short run. And a long term, the long run will be to, let's say, encourage more renewable energy production. So encourage people to import and install the solar photovoltaic panels on the household, and over a long period of time. So yes, you have an upfront cost, and over a period of time you will recover your upfront cost. And after you recover your upfront cost, essentially what will happen, you have essentially, like, I wouldn't say economies of scale, but your cost will be so low that the cost of electricity production for individual household will be relatively low. So this is something that can be done on a longer term, not on a short term. Now, in the context of Trinidad and Tobago, in terms of electricity production comes from almost 100% from natural gas. We are a natural gas-based economy. So when you have volatile oil price conditions in the international market, in terms of electricity production, it's not going to directly affect Trinidad and Tobago, because we have reserves of natural gas, we have natural gas production, and T and Tech and all the different independent power producers generate electricity from natural gas-based combustion. So we shield it from that aspect, but we're not shielded from the transport fuel side, because we are now importing the different fuels. So we are importing diesel, we are importing gasoline, and we're importing, let's say, bunker fuel and so forth. So when these prices go up, we will import inflation from that perspective. But really and truly, a long-term solution will be try to increase your local aggregate supply. And yes, you go to school, you do economics class, you hear about aggregate demand, aggregate supply. But what this really means in a local context is that you need to start to produce more locally. You need to try to reduce the dependence on imports. Because the reality is that if you have sufficient local production, it will help shield you from when you have these external macroeconomic shocks. When you have things occurring in a global economy that you have no control over, you should have some way to protect yourself against these mechanisms. And one of the ways you can do this is by trying to increase local production. I mean, I'm saying this now, and for any country, any government, this is very difficult. This is really a long-term goal that could be achieved maybe a 10 or 15-year period of time. But they are low-hanging fruits. And one of the low-hanging fruits you can achieve is definitely with the hydroponics and aquaponics. You can create some, let's say, primary agriculture products. Let's say short-term crops, green leafy vegetables. There's a wide range of short-term crops and even short-rooting crops that can be cultivated with the hydroponics and aquaponics that can be used to help increase local production. And this can, to some extent, offset the amount of imports for any country. So there are things that you can do in the short run to help alleviate the situation.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that.
It's
Yes, Mr. Diallo, you wanted to add. Go ahead, please. We lost
yes,
that
I'll
first
just
part of
say
what you. Yes, go
to
ahead.
Dr. Charles are the same hydroponics chemicals that we need to use to get the plants and the leafy green vegetables growing is generally offshoots of petroleum products, because you have to manufacture the different types of chemicals
Fertilizer.
for it, the
Yeah, yeah,
potassiums and so on and so forth. So
yeah.
yes, it is, and it is a low hanging to some degree. But I think the greater thing for us as small island developing states is that we have to now strategize because these oil crises, we have had them more than once. And we, as government and as a people, we have to strategize in the long term where we use PV panels and how it's going to affect our economy. Because if we go on a strategy to do that, electric vehicles and all of that, that is where we have to go because we have sun almost 300 plus days a year. And that, yes, is more medium to long, but this is where the government probably can now strategize and say, guys, in the short term, we could give some relief, but in the medium to long, you as an individual need to seriously consider converting your house to PV panels and solar energy where you can, so that you could reduce your consumption on energy and consider more hybrid and EV vehicles in your mix in terms of what you import in terms of vehicle fuel consumption. So we have started in Grenada in terms of EV and hybrid. The government now needs to expand that and get more serious as to how we strategize over a 5-year or 3-year period. And again, Doc, we come back to the issue of how long this war is going to go on for. That we don't
But
know.
but
And
not only how long it will go on for, but even if it ends today, right? Even if
yes,
it ends today, then those long-term impacts. I mean, you've seen the destruction of oil storage, fuel storage places in Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and all of that. Even in Iran, the U.S. destroyed several oil storage infrastructure. Now we're hearing that they're mining the Strait of Hormuz. So is the Strait of Hormuz safe at all for any type of kind
yeah.
of normal trader or return to that normalcy anytime soon? So sorry, I didn't mean to cut
And
you,
that
but
is the challenge, Dr. Bob, because the longer it prolongs, the longer Iran and these countries are going to get into areas to protect themselves to some degree. And of course, that is going to affect. I mean, to me, Russia is the greatest beneficiary of this war.
Yes.
Because Europe is now negotiating with them to take gas from them because they're worried about winter, as Doc indicated before, and what is going to happen. And there's someone
he
to
who
some
laughs
degree to
last, he who laughs last, laughs the best.
that's right. And I mean, Russia engaged in a number of things in the front. So I mean, it's really going to change the geopolitics and the dynamics, as Dr. Charles was alluding to, in what we
Yeah.
know as normal, economically and otherwise, and how these countries are going to trade. The US is
Yeah.
going to release probably millions of barrels of their storage, but they can't do that for long. They can't, and because
Yeah.
their gas prices have started increasing significantly.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
they have to temper it as well. So
Yeah.
it is
But let us talk about this. Don't we all miss? I don't know, Trinidad. I don't think Trinidad had the Petro-Carib agreement that we had with the late Hugo Chavez of
Yes.
Venezuela and Maduro. Assuming that Maduro and Chavez and so on was still there, wouldn't Petro-Carib be of great benefit to the region at this point, given that we
it
received
would.
sort of concessionary prices on oil imports,
I know part of the
petrochemical imports?
Petro-Carib deal have a loan component to it as well. So based
But
on
that's
where the
true.
prices went and elevated, they will cushion it. But they obviously governments that were part of the Petro-Carib arrangement would defer some of the costs into a long-term loan. We can't do that now with Venezuela. Even Trinidad trying to get the Dragon Field arrangement in place for the country in terms of natural gas and buying it
Yeah.
from Venezuela. So there's a lot of interplay here that, and uncertainty because Prime Minister Bessassa is trying to get that arrangement worked out. So, and as Doc said, part of the problem with Venezuela crude is a high sulfur content. They have a lot of crude, but their refinery capacity is very small. And the companies like the BPs and so on, the investment that you have to get those refineries going is going to be significantly high. Yes, they're getting a windfall now with the prices, but to get these refineries going would not happen tomorrow. It will happen a few years from now. So the impact is still going to be significant for the countries if they ramp up, like Guyana and Trinidad, if they could ramp up the refinery capability, because as Doc indicated, Trinidad took a decision to mothball one of the major refineries. So, I mean, could they pull that back? So it's a lot of, but to me, the general impact for us is that we are going to see increases in prices. And we have to find a way, as we discussed a little earlier, how we can reduce the impact through the various mechanisms that some governments may have on their radar.
Mr. Diallo, if I may, and I'll get Dr. Charles to pick up on this. You know, the fastest growing economy, one of the fastest growing economies in the world right now is Ghana, which is a CARICOM member state. Yeah. In CARICOM, we talk about allyship and we talk about working together. In fact, Guyana was that country that was supposed to be the one that was going to help us with our food security challenges. I remember when President Ali declared that food security initiative that we were going to be scaling up, you know, food production that our CARICOM neighbors can rely on, so that we do not rely on that heavy importation that happens from the global north. To the extent that that is of any success right now, I think the jury is out on that. But that aside, Guyana, of course, they are the one of the world's, will be, of course, one of the great players of the world in terms of oil production. What can Guyana do to assist their CARICOM neighbors in sort of, you know, really reducing that blow, that inflationary blow that will come from these high oil prices?
Well, as Doc indicated, their production levels in terms of barrels have not reached 100,000 barrels yet, but they're still working on capacity constraints. And Guyana in the past had some discussions with Trinidad and the OECS to run pipelines for natural gas between the countries, and that project was put on hold by and Trinidad and some of, because of the cost to run the pipeline. So immediately, if you were talking to generation electricity and we were to switch what we do with diesel into natural gas, that will significantly help. You understand? And when you combine it with, of course, the push for PV and PV use. So it is, even though, Dr. Bob, we talk about where Guyana is and the strongest growing economy and how they could help for this issue, is if they could divert what the refined oil to us that we use, that we need to use. And that is going to be something CARICOM will have to have a discussion in terms of how Guyana could help the region, particularly OECS. Barbados have some degree of oil production, but they also export their oil for refining. So it is going to be something that needs to be urgently put. Again, I hate this song as well, are repeating. If this war prolongs, it is going to be something that we have to deal with. And I think just as how we try to mitigate loss and risk with hurricanes that come to our region, we have to now start to think strategically about how we consume in terms of energy and where we go. And CARICOM as a region need to adopt, you know, a strategy to deal with that, because it is going to be forever there.
Yeah, energy security is economic security, and by extension, national security and all of that. But Dr. Charles, please pick up on that. Obviously, you know, crude oil and all of that falls under. I say neoliberalism as a critical scholar, but it falls under economics. Okay, people are not here. You know, the oil industry. They're not necessarily benevolent people. Okay, they're not going to be giving you free oil and anything like that. So let's talk about the role of Guyana here, even in the context of the food security that you referenced earlier, because that is also a major issue.
So when speaking about, let's say, regional cooperation, because essentially the theme is regional cooperation. So we have Guyana. Guyana is an emerging economic powerhouse. It has significant reserves of crude oil. It is increasing its production of crude oil on an annual basis. I know right now its production of oil is over 600,000 barrels per day. So its production is continuously increasing. We see Guyana right about now, in terms of the whole CARICOM region, it has the highest economic growth on an annual basis. So I mean, things are looking very good in terms of the basic statistics. Things are looking favorable for Guyana right about now. And if you're looking at the direction of regional cooperation, something like this was attempted, let's say, almost 20 years ago with the whole Petro-Caribe. And I remember when I was a student in class, and my lecturer was explaining to me about the whole concept of cooperative advantage. So we're doing international trade, and we're familiar with comparative advantage, and they were coming up with the concept of cooperative advantage. Essentially, what it means is that ignore all the basic economic statistics. It means that here, you have a need, and I can try to help you address that need. So we are neighbors, we are partners. Let us cooperate and let us build an advantage by cooperating with each other. So it sounds nice when they pitched it like that, but like you said, there was like it was like a two-edged sword, because yes, you could get the oil at concessional prices, but at the same point in time, you would have, like, let's say, part of the discounted prices was really a loan. So what really happened is that you had countries in the Caribbean that signed on to the Petro-Caribe agreement was really increasing their debt to Venezuela. And this was, yes, it's economics, but this was also, like, let's say, some kind of political economics, because I mean, when you have high debt to a country, you know, because of the politics, more inclined to support certain countries when they will have certain, let's say, geopolitical goals and ideas and positions and so forth. So there are implications. And I mean, so that was the perspective of Venezuela and, let's say, the Petro-Caribe agreement. Now, the difference between Venezuela and the difference between Venezuela and, let's say, Guyana is that the oil industry in Guyana is more or less, I wouldn't say control, but it is strongly influenced by the multinational corporations, specifically ExxonMobil. They are the main company right about now that is in control of, let's say, exploration and production activity in Guyana, and they produce oil for export for the international markets. Now, the difference with Venezuela, there was a national oil company that was strongly influenced by the government and government policies and government objectives. So yeah, you almost had a situation where the government could have control or dictate its policy and kind of make an agreement like that. But in the case of Guyana, that is not the same situation. You have the multinationals, they have their agenda, and they do not have a regional or, let's say, a geopolitical agenda of such a nature. They are in the country, they want to extract the oil, extract whatever natural resource, and sell it in the international market and try to fetch as best a price as possible and make a profit. They do not have, let's say, a regional geopolitical agenda like that. So that is one of the key differences. So in terms of, like, let's say, Guyana are trying to offer, let's say, any agreement similar to, like, let's say, Petro-Caribe to the Caribbean region, I do not see something like that happening within the near term, especially in a situation where they do not directly control the exploration and production activities, and they actually relying on foreign capital, foreign investors to actually come and develop and essentially operate their oil industry in the country. I do not see like something like that happening within a near term or any short term period of time. What I can see is that in the context of agriculture, they have vast amounts of land. So yes, we know we have agriculture, and yes, we know there are different technologies that can be used to produce primary agricultural products. I can see that there can be some form of collaboration, and I say collaboration, but there can be some kind of production or some kind of regional value chains where you have some kind of primary agricultural production occurring in Guyana. There's some kind of processing, and then there's export of the primary agricultural products, or even some kind of processed products towards the, let's say, the CARICOM region. So I mean, this is possible. They can have some production, they can have some kind of processing, and they can export to the region. And that actually is a win-win for the region, because one, when they do something like that, you will earn more export revenue. And because international trade and you're competing against different players in international trade, you could see we can see some kind of reduction in prices, at least on the agricultural side, because if the producers from Guyana could produce and export at a lower price than competing suppliers to the Caribbean region in terms of agricultural goods, I mean, this can work to their advantage. This could work to the advantage of the different Caribbean countries that are seeking to import primary agricultural products. So this can work. What could actually will happen in practice is yet to be determined, because I mean, it all depends on who want to produce, the distribution, the supply chain networks, and all these intricate details. So I mean, yes, theoretically this can happen, but in practice, I mean, we have to actually see which stakeholders are actually interested in pursuing such an objective. But right now, this is an idea, this is not actual a policy initiative what is being implemented right about now. But it's definitely good. It's definitely good for regional collaboration and building up, like, let's say, a regional value chain, because ideally that's what's supposed to be happening as CARICOM. So yes, we have CARICOM. Yes, we're supposed to have free movement of labor, and we're supposed to have free movement of goods, but we're really supposed to have regional collaboration in production of goods, and produce goods in one country, have some processing in the next country, and export throughout the whole region. That's essentially what CARICOM is supposed to be, as a functional form of common market.
Well, at the end of the day, I do not know that
stuff
Ghana
out of Ghana consistently. Both on the food side, the only thing we do consistently out of Ghana is sand for the entire region, and it's because it's bad. But when you have to refrigerate stuff that are perishable, we have absolutely no consistent transport mode to facilitate that. That's why the plan moved to 2030, and the first part of the plan never worked, because there is just nobody investing in transport, whether it be refrigerated on ships or whether it be airplanes. So that is a challenge, and we have not seen the CARICOM region to work that out.
And the infrastructure is just not in place. I mean,
that's right.
I'm just asking myself, what have we learned from COVID? Have we learned anything from COVID? Have we really? Is there anything that we realistically implemented that we can look to say on a microeconomic level, on a regional level, at a CARICOM level, that says, okay, this came from COVID as a result of, this is a legacy of a crisis that we experienced in COVID? Anything?
Yeah, we had sunset legislations. That was consistent after COVID.
Remote work and Zoom, online communication.
Yeah, remote work. Yes. But structurally, to deal with those structural challenges that we are confronted with in CARICOM, the jury is still out on this. I mean, food security continues to be an issue. Scaling up food production is an issue. In Grenada, that's what, to me, that's has become a buzzword now. Agro-industrial processing, blah blah blah. What has resulted?
I mean, Trinidad benefits the most from Guyana in terms of fruit and importation of fruits and vegetables, because of the distance between Trinidad and Guyana, and the cost of freight, to move is. But once you pass and you start Grenada and OECS, the freight significantly increases, and it's not consistent. Boats will come up loaded, but they go back down empty. That is part of the problem in terms of negotiation, freight, and have it actually work. And that is a challenge in CARICOM we can't solve up to this day.
What I can say in terms of the agriculture, in terms of the agriculture industry, is that we have some local production within Trinidad, but Trinidad and Tobago has a relatively strong agro-processing industry, because we have many agro-processors in the country. So we have a wide range. If you look at the shelf, we have a wide range of canned and packaged products that are sold locally within Trinidad, as well as other Caribbean countries. Actually, the primary market for Trinidad and Tobago's agro-processed products is really the Caribbean market. So I mean, this can work. And so I'm not saying this in the context like let's say I'm lobbying in favor of Trinidad and Tobago. I'm saying this in the context of the Caribbean region, in the sense that this could work, in the sense that there's scope to use the CARICOM market to benefit, in the sense that we can have production. The agriculture industry is one example. We have some kind of agro processing. We import the inputs, we process create the products, a more finished product, and export that more finished product and get more value from the value chain, and that product goes towards the CARICOM markets. And this can work, this can help. So essentially, your neighbors helping build each other. That's essentially what. So I remember when I was in undergrad, I doing international trade. That is what I thought regional integration is supposed to be. But I mean, what we see in practice is like this is more like just a document. It will create some kind of CSME agreement document, and it just sits there and nothing really happens. So I mean,
Yeah, Doc,
this
and that
what
is because we have prime ministers who are politically motivated, and they have to constantly consider in 5 years' time if they will be there. Comparing that to a Chinese situation where they plan 50 and 100 years ahead, and everybody stays aligned. In these small countries like ours, that is the difference for us, and we constantly worry about what happened in 5 years hence.
Yeah.
Mr. Diali, one more thing, and then we get to closing comments. The Grenlec bill in Grenada. Are you anticipating? Of course, we know that I believe a cap was removed in September last year, right? And folks have seen an increase in their bills. Will that get worse now with everything that's happening? And
well,
again,
I mean, Grenlec normally does an average over 3 months, I believe, and levy their charges based on the cost of imports of fuel. But if this is, we may get a delay in the immediate sense in terms of increases, because the effect probably have not reached us significantly as in terms of oil price increases. And Grenlec has to pay. The cash flow is going to be one of the areas they have to manage significantly if the oil prices start to pass 120 a barrel, and what is going to happen. Because significantly, if they is to pay, let's say, $300,000 for a shipment, that's going to move to 600,000 or less, but it's going to seriously impact. And they have to be able to recover in order for them to continue as a producer of energy. So at the end of the day, it's going to be a challenge. Grenlec is now owned by the government. So at the end of the day, government could come in and see what they can do or not. But their hands are also going to be tied, because if you want to make a consistent supply and not happen what's going on in Cuba because of the oil blockade, and you're getting 3 hours a day for energy, to keep that going, you will have to leverage some increases, I suspect, in the short to medium term. And is based on the magnitude of that increase, we will probably have to temper, but you have to temper that with, from a Grenlec point of view, of how you're going to meet future purchases in terms of the cash that you will rake in from the bills, and how you're going to meet that going forward. So it's going to be a challenge all the way around, but I expect the increases will come. Depends on the length of this war.
Yeah, and then finally, one of the opportunities that resulted from this climate crisis that we're experiencing was renewable energy, right? There's always a renewable energy craze, whether it's geothermal, whether it's solar,
and wind.
And wind, there you go.
And wave and all sorts of things.
And all sorts of things. I mean, here we are speaking about a global crisis generated because of our dependence on fossil fuels. And yet we can't seem to scale up significantly to get to a place where we can now rely on these renewable energy sources as the basis for reducing our dependence on fossil fuels. Dr. Charles, I want to get your thoughts on that.
So I will address that comment and from two aspects. So renewable energy is good, but there's two challenges yes, there's really more than two challenges, but there's two challenges I want to point out. One is an economic challenge, and the second is, let's say, an environmental challenge. So yes, you can let's say you look at solar photovoltaics. You put a panel on top of your household, building, whatever. But at the same point in time, every so often there's some kind of adverse weather event. There's hurricane, there's tropical cyclone, and so forth. And you can put a solar photovoltaic panel, and then it can be a situation like Jamaica, but you have no control. A hurricane come and it causes significant damage and destruction to your country, and all these solar photovoltaics that you have installed all over the place can be destroyed. That is a risk. The reality is that there is a weather risk associated with the entire Caribbean region. So that's one factor. The other factor is in terms of cost. So, and this is just the structure of the economics. Renewable energy, so it doesn't really matter if you go the direction of, let's say, solar, if you go wind, if you go wave, you have an upfront you have an upfront capital cost. There's an upfront cost. There's a cost you have to pay to install the physical infrastructure. The operational cost is low because I mean you don't have to pay for the sunlight. The sun, I mean, you get sunlight every day, so the solar insolation comes every day. So you don't have to pay for this. And once you have your infrastructure is in place, you really don't. Your operational cost is next to nothing. However, the obstacle to many people is that they do not understand the project economics and they do not understand you have an upfront cost and it will allow to give you cost savings. And after a period of time, 4 years, 5 years, you recover your upfront costs, and then everything else is basically like a savings or a profit for you. Because after you cover your initial investment, your cost is next to nothing, and that is the reality. And that is the case with project economics almost everywhere. Now, in the context of, let's say, an LNG facility or a large-scale multinational investor, they understand the project economics. So they understand that here, I have a lot of money. I will go into Guyana and I'll put down facility for a refinery. I'll put down facility to engage in oil and gas production and so forth. I will spend millions. I'll spend $300-400 million. I don't really mind. Why? Because as a multinational, I understand that there's an upfront capital cost. You will generate some revenue. You'll have some kind of, like, let's say, a monthly or annual profit, but over time you'll recover your upfront capital costs. There will be some kind of economies of scale, and in the long run, 10-15 years down the road, there will be windfall profits that you're going to make. The multinational business understands this, and the multinational business tend to invest, that tend to be involved in a lot of, let's say, capital projects with high sunk costs. They understand this, but the average layman who is required to, let's say, spend about, in terms of US dollars, maybe about $4,000 or $5,000 to put a solar photovoltaic system on a household to generate electricity and cover this money, this investment over a 5-year period of time. A lot of the average people do not understand this, so they're just looking at this money they're putting out, this $5,000-6,000 they're putting out to install this solar photovoltaic system on a household. They're looking at it as a cost that they, I think, incur like almost continuously, when that is not the case. You incur a cost now, and then you don't have to incur that cost maybe for the next 10 or 15 years. But for that period of time, after 5 years, you recover that, and for the next 10 years, it's just profit you're incurring. And that is one of the major obstacles towards the implementation of renewable energy projects in the Caribbean region. A lot of people don't understand economics. So, I mean, it is an obstacle, the cost is a barrier, and they just don't invest. They see it as something that is not for them to do.
Absolutely. Gentlemen, this was such a very important conversation here. Really, it was an education for me, and I hope for the viewers and listeners who'll be watching this as well. But Mr. Diali, sir, I want to go over to you for some closing comments. And of course, before I do, sir, now that you're retired, I suspect you will be representing PBC cannons in the intercall. You get your blue already and representing PBC.
Of course, the PVC cannons we have to give them as much support as we need to.
Yes.
No choice about that.
In your day at PBC, did PBC win intercall? Were you that era?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. That's why I tell Grenadians, PBC won intercall before, but
Yeah, when we compare ourselves in terms of size to the other person GBSS at the time,
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Thank you, sir. Okay, sir. Thank you again.
So I was going to say that, Kellan, this is a difficult situation for any government in any country. It is not an easy solution to come up with. It's going to require all of us to put our heads together and see how, if this war is prolonged, where we can help and where we can adjust and make differences. And I said earlier, I believe it starts with the individual. You have to look at your situation and how it may change and how it's going to affect you, and see how you can make adjustments to save in terms of cost and usage of the different products like fuel and energy from our supply of energy. So it is going to, you can't say, let's government do this or do that and so on, because it has impact on the entire nation. So it's going to be a difficult ride if this war is prolonged. And, we had to take it one day because, as Dr. Charles indicated, you could close at the price of oil at $80 a barrel, and when you wake up tomorrow morning, it's 120, based on how the things are happening in the geopolitical sway.
Absolutely, Mr. Diali. Thank you so much. Dr. Charles, over to you, sir, again. It's always a pleasure having you on the program. Over to you for some closing comments, sir.
So the reality is that the Caribbean is a small region. We are small. We are a chain of small islands. We are highly dependent on trade. We are highly vulnerable to a series of macroeconomic as well as environmental and other external shocks. That is just reality. We are vulnerable, and we need to try to look to see how we can build resilience. So although the situation now is the conflict, the armed conflict that is occurring in the Middle East, which is driving high oil prices right about now, even if this wasn't the case, even if it wasn't the conflict in the Middle East, something would have happened, and then you can find yourself in a situation you're either facing high shipping costs, high oil prices, or just general inflation overall. This is not something new to the region, so the region needs to look towards building resilience and resilience against these external shocks. And this is where you try to implement policies and procedures to help build your productive capacity. So you can try to see how you can increase local production of different goods. And I mean, yes, we want to reach a particular level, but they are low-hanging fruits. So you cannot achieve, Rome wasn't built in a day. You cannot achieve your overall goal in one day. So you start with the small steps upon small steps, and gradually over time you build resilience. So today could be one low-hanging fruit, tomorrow could be another low-hanging fruit, and over time you become a stronger country, and the region as a whole becomes stronger and more resilient to these external shocks. So my recommendation to any country in the region is to help build their local productive capacity and help strengthen the local systems.
Absolutely. Mr. Diali, Dr. Charles, thank you so much for appearing on the Bub Report this week.
Go there.
You are a technocrat. I mean, you can speak to whether or not it was appropriate or inappropriate for that to occur. Would you have done that as a permanent secretary?
Politicians get the information from wherever source that they can.
That's going to be the extent of your answer.
Yeah. Don't go there.
There's a lot of noise around the data protection bill that, in my respectful view, is not warranted.
I was one of those making noise, and it's simply because I was concerned about that specific Section 33.
Don't go there.
Are you going to be offering yourself up as political leader of the party?
I see you've called me have a much more than diplomatic passport. I don't mind that.
Don't go there.
What is the relationship like between you and your leader, Dr. Mitchell, your boss, Dr. Mitchell?
I'm not sure how to explain how to answer this question at this time. I prefer not to answer.
Don't go there.
They said that you approached the bank for the loan before the election and that it only materialized after the election. There are also conflicting reports around the quantity of monies that were received. What is the reality here?
People try to extort the truth and to make all kinds of things about it. I just stay quiet. So if you notice, I was really and truly quiet about the whole matter.
Well, except with not with the New Today newspaper. The New Today newspaper reported on this, so I'm not sure you were quiet on this. Go ahead, Honorable. Go ahead.
Well, I'm just trying to answer your question, right?
Don't go there.
I think we just spoke at length about the regularization framework. So
yes, we did. But let us talk, Prime Minister. Let us talk about the workers who are dismissed.
The Bub Report. We go there.
Hi, everyone. The Bub Report is committed to being fearless, balanced, and independent, bringing you the stories that matter most without compromise. Now, do us a favor. Remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Hit the bell so you never miss an update. You can also watch us on GBN TV every Wednesday at 5 p.m. Catch us on WPG10 television every Sunday at 8 p.m. Your support helps us to keep journalism free from bias and influence. And together, we can make sure every voice is heard and every fact is verified. Thanks for watching.